So tell us about the ways, given where you are at the moment and the topic of the day, how fintech and technology can play a role in this post-COVID world.
Hello, good morning. This is a great question and a very important one due to the inequality characteristic of this pandemic. So I think that this is the pandemic that is really raising some of the problems that we had in the economy and among different groups of the society. And I think that digital and fintech will play a significant role in the recovery phase. Why do I think that? Firstly, because there are just a few, there are 3 billion people in the world that do not have access to internet and do not have access to any digital device. So these people are left behind in this recovery. Therefore, it is very important to continue the digitalization, to provide digital means to people that can really get into the economy and benefit from the externalities that it creates. Fintech can play a significant role, because we know that it allows people to have access to digital financial services without the need to really go to specific branches or to specific locations.
How does the role of the private sector, has it changed in this post-COVID world in terms of the usefulness of public-private relationships and arrangements, for example? How do you see that dynamic playing out?
I think that this is going to change significantly. It's already changing, and basically because, as we know, the fiscal space will be very limited. So in the world, many countries have increased their fiscal deficits up to 10% of GDP. On average, in Asia Pacific, it is 5% of GDP, which means that governments will have very limited capacity to really use public resources to support the recovery phase. And in that context, what we will need is to crowd in private sector. What we will need is to really make sure or create the conditions for the private sector to come back again to these economies and to shape and to help in the recovery. No? So the role of the private sector is probably more needed than ever due to the circumstances of this pandemic and the way that the economies can respond to the current situation.
Private sector more needed makes perfectly good sense. But what specifically are you looking for the private sector to do? Many private companies have financial stresses of their own, particularly banks. I think there's some question about to what extent banks are asked to take steps, forbearance, many things, loan to less creditworthy companies that could hurt them in the long run, maybe even the short run. So specifically, what is your idea for private sector companies to do to help rebuild when the government can't?
So what I think is that this crisis really brings and opens a huge opportunity for the private sector. So in terms of, let's focus on at least 3 what we call or what I would think the 3 key pillars of the recovery. No? One of them could be the disruption on supply chains. So this crisis has really changed many of the paradigms that we have before, and is changing the way that many supply chains are being structured in different sectors. Let's say tourism, textile, and agribusiness, etc. So there is a huge opportunity to take the lead in this new reshaping of the value chains. But the second one could be digitalization, as you mentioned before. There is a great opportunity, and we have seen it with e-health, with e-education, with digital financial services, with e-trade platforms, etc. So they need to really advance on the digitalization of every single business is a clear consequence of this crisis. No? And the third one, which is, in my opinion, the future probably to really achieve a resilient recovery, is the climate-related businesses. We know that there is a huge opportunity for the private sector to transform many of the business models that we have and benefit from the greening of the economy that will happen in the next years. What is the role that the private sector need to play? I think that is to really bring back, to build back better, and the public sector, what they should do is to crowd in the private sector by creating smart solutions and incentives to do that.
You read my mind. So if the private sector is needed and has so many opportunities there, are there any regulatory changes that are needed? Do governments have to offer tax credits, other kinds of support and incentive for them to take these big steps in these very important places?
Right. I think that at least we could think on the three different areas of clear activity or clear action from the public sector. No? One could be in terms of the risking, what we call risk-sharing facilities, for instance. So basically trying to cover or to help the private sector by covering part of the risk that they take into when coming into a specific sector or a specific economy. So we need to avoid the public sector to play a 100% role in any of these sectors or in any of this financing, and really to incentivize the public sector, the private sector, to come in by taking part of the loss. So this could be one area. The second area are the regulatory reforms, and there is one area that is particularly relevant in my opinion, which is all related with insolvency frameworks. We need to avoid that firms that are viable but not liquid comes into liquidation immediately. And this is a problem that this crisis can generate. But we also need to avoid that zombie firms remain forever. So having a strong and good insolvency framework for corporate restructuring will be key. And the third one is to create the conditions for what I called before the climate-related business. So really to create the conditions for the private sector to start producing differently, servicing differently, to minimize the physical risk and the transition risk that the climate change is happening and is affecting the economies. No?